Hello, my name is Trevor Harris, and I am proud to be a participant and a collaborator in the KOPN Oral History Project. We've reached out to founders and those individuals who were active in the early years of KOPN, and one of the people we came up with was James Robnett. So I'll let him introduce himself, and then I'm going to ask him a series of questions about his work with KOPN. So I'll model the behavior I want. My name is Trevor Harris, and I'm a current KOPN programmer. Would you, sir, please introduce me and tell me who you are and what you do?
My name is James Robnett Jr. Since it takes two parents to have a child, I usually say James Figueroa. My mother was from Puerto Rico, and my dad, Robnett, from St. Louis. And I'm named after him, so James Figueroa Robnett Jr. I'm retired from the state, and I do some volunteer work now with the NAACP. I'm a member of the Fulton branch of the NAACP, and I work with the state branch of the NAACP on prison issues.
And that is not a new interest or concern of yours. I want to get into the role you played at KOPN. So, and maybe just tell us kind of what your gig was here, what you did at KOPN.
We had a program when I moved here in 1980. I was still doing work in the prisons for legislators in the Missouri Assembly, and they would get letters from either inmates or their families and ask me and another man named Mr. James Bush to go in and find out what's going on. So we would try to get the inmate side of the story, the Department of Corrections. It wasn't a department then. It was the Division of Corrections under Social Service. Later it became its own department. And we would get their version of what happened, and we would try to work at a just resolution. So when I came up here to Missouri U to go to law school in 1980, I had been here to KOPN before. The first time was in 1976. I was asked to come up and do an interview not on prison issues, but on the presidential election that year. So that's how I first became familiar with KOPN. But in 1980, somehow, the program Zebra Sunrise already existed. I don't know if it had started in 80 or 79, but the program manager, Bill Wax, from me talking to him, he wrote some CETA grants and got jobs for three former inmates, a guy named Butch Grace, a woman named Octavia Hayes, and a man named another guy, Jim Ellinger. And somehow they heard about me and I heard about them, and we connected. So I became part of their staff. And every Sunday we would do a 2-hour program at KOPN on issues, not just in the Missouri Department of Corrections relating to inmates, but even local issues with the local jails and even issues inmates had to face, former inmates, when they came back out into society. So it was four of us. There's usually 4 Sundays in a month. So each one of us would do a Sunday program on these issues.
So for the uninformed, for the ill-informed, what was Zebra Sunrise? Just to back up a step, if I'd never heard of it before.
Zebra Sunrise was a weekly 2-hour program on Sunday morning. We usually, I believe, ran from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., but it was run by 3 former inmates and myself, and we focused primarily on issues in the Missouri Department of Corrections. At that time, the Missouri Department of Corrections was going through changes, and what I mean is in the 60s, 70s, and before then, the Department of Corrections philosophy was not about rehabilitation, even if they stated it was. We came across issues where inmates were beaten and other negative measures were used in the system. And I worked with one group called Lifers Incorporated that was trying to, it was a group inside the prisons, and they were trying to change the department to make it more oriented toward rehabilitation and more humane. For instance, two of the members are still alive, Lewis Mack and Larry Thomas. They filed a suit, I can't remember if it was the late 70s or early 80s, to get the old Missouri State Penitentiary, where you can go do tours now, and pay the Jeff City, I don't know what group down there for tours to tour the old Missouri State Penitentiary. But they, in their suit, they filed two complaints. One was the prison was overcrowded, unconstitutionally overcrowded. They won on that point. But the second point was they wanted better health care provided, and they lost on that point. But those were two of the issues that, and those were two inmates that I work with. And so other issues, as I said, there was a guy named Ron Parton. His parents lived here, and they used to work at the old Knowles store on Worley in the flower department. And their son was beaten at the Missouri prison, at the Missouri State Penitentiary, beaten unconscious. And so people fought to get him an attorney, and he successfully sued, and you can you can Google the suit, Ron Parton versus, I don't know if it was the name against the warden, Donna Wyrick, or Donna Wyrick as an employee of the Missouri Department of Corrections. But he won his suit. He won a $96,000 jury verdict against the warden for unconstitutionally beating him without due process of law. So those were the kind of issues we fought on back then. Today I work with the state NAACP on a volunteer basis, and the issues have changed. We actually have a NAACP branch in the prison that replaced the old Missouri State Penitentiary. It's called the Jefferson City Correctional Center. It's a Department of Corrections facility. But our branch is trying to change the 85% sentencing laws, which came from the 90s at the federal level. It was called the Truth in Sentencing Law, and basically it was a measure to say we have to get tough on people who commit crimes, and some people who commit crimes shouldn't even be considered for parole until they've served 85% of their sentence. And we work with a group called Empower Missouri, ACLU, a number of organizations in a coalition efforts. We were able to get changes made for nonviolent offenders. The Republicans control the legislature now. Prior to then, the Democrats did. But in that prior era, the Democrats did. But the Republicans were willing to help lower that 85% threshold down to 50% in the past few years for nonviolent offenders, but not for violent offenders. So those are more the issues today, as well as health care still.
So you're involved in prison reform today. You were involved in prison reform 42 years ago when you first set foot in here. That you told us what you work on, but why do you do it?
I came up in the 1960s, and what I learned in law school, I grew up under the criminal procedures law. I grew up in North St. Louis near the old original Bush Stadium, right off Grant and Sullivan Avenue. And even then, just like people are seeking police reform today, we were trying to seek police reform then, because you didn't have reasonable search and seizure laws or reasonable suspicion laws. The police could just say you're loitering, you're a vagrant, and haul you off to jail. And I would observe a paddy wagon pull up and pick up a gang of youth and take them straight to the city jail. And so we felt, yes, police do need to police and keep the streets safe. But at the same time, and their job is hard, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, there has to be some rationality to how they police. And so I began getting involved. Then, as a youth, I was involved in high school in protests, both and nonviolent protest movements and walkouts and things like that. But we were fighting on discrimination issues. We were against, at that time, the war in Vietnam. So I was a young activist way back in high school, and even became a youth member, joined when I was a youth, the St. Louis branch of the Angela Davis Defense Committee. And I was learning about prison issues way back then. And so when Angela won her case and was free, a national organization was formed called the Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and our objective was to help similarly situated people as she was fight for their freedom. So I forget the boxer's name, the Hurricane. We worked with church organizations, and they were eventually successful in getting him free.
Reuben Carter.
Yes, Reuben Carter. Thank you. My memory chip wasn't working as well as yours.
I'm thinking back to my Bob Dylan song, and its name
Or the Reverend Ben Chavis. He was an NAACP activist in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he and 9 of his associates, 10 of his associates were arrested and put in jail. And we eventually, again, working in coalition with other groups and organizations, were able to get him, all 10 of them, free on appeal. And so, but we also had to uncover a lot of misdeeds by the prosecution and other entities that were involved. And so we tried to work on cases, or the case of Geronimo Pratt. He was a Black Panther, he was an activist, and he was kept in jail for 2 murders he didn't commit. For instance, Nelson Mandela was kept in jail for 26 years for his activism. I believe Geronimo Pratt, he was a Black Panther, was kept in jail for 26, maybe a little longer than Nelson Mandela, for 2 offenses he never committed. And later, after he was free, Johnny Cochran worked for his freedom also, but he was able to help him sue both the FBI and the LA Police Department in a civil suit and to get financial remuneration for what turned out to be him being jailed and a loss of freedom and a loss of those years of his life when he was not even in no way connected to the offense he was convicted of.
It sounds like the work that you were doing just needed a way to be amplified, and that KOPN was a mechanism to amplify that activism.
Yes, what I liked is we had a community radio station in St. Louis. I can't remember the name. I know it was on
KDNA.
it was on St. Louis Avenue. Okay.
Was it KDNA? Became KDHX.
I can't recall, but
Anyway.
we did stories like KOPN with Zebra Sunrise on issues of that day, whether it was the movement in Cairo, Illinois called the United Front, and that's the one I worked around there. But coming up here was just great to find a community-based radio station, allowing the community, whether it's art or issues in the movement or whatever it might be, to broadcast over the air here.
So talk about the first time that you walked in here. What was your impression of KOPN?
Well, the facilities here were larger than our community radio station in St. Louis. But as I said, the first time I was interviewed on the presidential race then, but when I actually became involved, it was great to see a radio station hire 3 former inmates and allow them to talk about the issues that not just in the prisons, but them as inmates outside of the prison now, the issues people returning to society had to face and deal with. So I don't know if a program existed like this anywhere else in the country. I'm not aware of one, but I thought that that was just an excellent job by the program managers here to create that program. And it also helped us. At that time, Department of Corrections, most of their facilities were in rural Missouri, in the Jeff City area, whether in Boonville, Moberly. You had the old church farm. You had the women's prison called Wren's Farm at that time. And so it also enabled us to reach the people who were inside, and we would receive letters from them. And so again, it gave people a voice and a way to try to change and improve the conditions they were under.
And the show itself was a combination of interviews, live in-person interviews, phone calls, as I recall it, and then the reading of letters. Was that the primary content of that?
Well, also, I would discuss my latest visits inside the prison and on different issues. So we didn't always get to do interviews per se, but we would, yes, read letters. We would go investigate and then report, and then the different members of the staff would report on issues they would want to report on, whether it was something they run into or whether it was jobs, trying to get jobs, or whatever former inmates would face when they would get out here in society, whether it was trying to get housing, jobs, etc. And one of the issues, you brought up a letter. There had been a prison riot up at Moberly Prison, and guard was killed, and it wasn't a riot. It was in one of the units, a guy attacked a guard. I don't know if other inmates were involved, but he murdered that guard. Well, we got word that then the guards were taking out that incident on all the inmates. And so we did receive a letter from an inmate up there that stated their version of what happened. And our staff member, Octavia Hayes, she had read the letter over the air. Well, the guards got an attorney, and I don't know if it was through their association or a few of them or what, but they sued KOPN for defamation. And so we didn't want that to have a chilling effect on our show, because that was their purpose. And we were fortunate to get a professor from Missouri School of Law, and she got the suit dismissed. But again, we had to learn from that. When we read letters, say this is this person's version, to keep the station from being sued. So Octavia learned that, but so did the rest of the staff. But I think we thought it was a given. If you're reading someone else's version of a story, you're not representing the station's version. You're trying to provide information. And so we did learn from that. We have to qualify our statements when we do read someone else's version of events.
And this is why the station to this day has a line item in the budget for lawsuits.
Wow.
I'm kidding. So I'm going to jump around a little bit, but tell me about a time something that you were doing relative to KOPN or Zebra Sunrise turned out better than you expected. Either a show or a project that you were like, I thought we were going to achieve this, and it's so much more.
Well, I think our consistent work on the issues in the Missouri Department of Corrections, eventually, it wasn't just us again at KOPN, but the program helped get the word out on what was going on. I think most, it's kind of true except for families directly affected by their relative who goes to prison. It's like put them behind the walls and throw away the key, and you don't know what's going on behind the walls. So at that time, the Department of Corrections, I think, was still, again, even though they may have professed otherwise, under a punishment type of culture, organizational culture, as opposed to rehabilitation. And that's what we were pushing. And prior to the show, I had work, as I said, with the group Lifers Incorporated, and they successfully fought for a program in the 70s prior to the show called the Educational Release Program, where inmates who got an associate degree in a prison could be eligible to apply for a program that would allow them to go to Lincoln and get a bachelor's degree. And they had worked with some people outside the prison system, of course, and even got legislators to agree to pass a law or let the Department of Corrections pass a rule that allowed the inmates to be transported to Lincoln in the day. And if they got a bachelor's degree, they were automatically eligible for parole. That program no longer exists, but the reason I bring it up, those were the kind of rehabilitation programs that we were hoping the system would, and they continued that even as I was up here at KOPN. I can't remember. I don't know if it was the mid or late 80s when the Department of Corrections finally ceased that program, but it started at the old Missouri State Penitentiary, and eventually they started housing the men and women who participated in that program at the old Wren's Farm, which was a women's prison back then. Eventually, Vandalia and Chillicothe prisons, women prisons, replaced that facility. But I think my point is, I think our efforts help to contribute to a more rehabilitative culture in the Department of Corrections. And well, I think you left those pictures outside, but
Let me go get them.
but the pictures I brought was of when we got a new head of corrections to come and visit our show. And his philosophy was rehabilitation. And the governor at the time was Governor Bond. In those days, both Governor Teasdale and Governor Bond were more for not just punishment, but rehabilitation efforts and programs within the Department of Corrections. And so the pictures that I brought you, Trevor, show the staff of the department. It shows one picture on the day that this picture shows Dr. Leroy Black, who had become the director of the Department of Corrections, and he was more into rehabilitation. The prior director, I believe his name was Mr. Blackwell, he was too, but I think he didn't know how to. It's like you had two types of wardens in Missouri prison. Those that were for a rehabilitation culture and those that were for a punishment culture. And in the punishment culture, inmates in those prisons normally faced sometime altercations or beatings. Whereas in the ones who fought for rehabilitation, they tried to implement programs in their prison to promote inmates getting skills or preparing themselves for their return to society. But what happened is we were able, the other picture I brought was, and Jim Ellinger, the three former inmates were Octavia Hayes, Butch Grace, and Jim Ellinger and myself. And we ran the program, but I think we did begin to make some progress to achieve changes. Now, the other picture I brought, and golly, I'd have to, again, my memory chip, I'd have to ask maybe Jim Ellinger. But these were two inmates who were beaten at the Missouri, not at the state penitentiary in Moberly, Missouri. Now, those guys were in a part of the prison called protective custody. So they were being protected because they feel they couldn't be out safely in the general population. But when the guards put down that riot, that incident at the Moberly prison, they went through all the units, and these two gentlemen said they were physically assaulted, and even though they weren't even in the building where the guard was murdered. And so they sued, but unfortunately the federal judge decided that they didn't produce harm. They didn't, they didn't, at their trial they weren't able to show physical harm. So they didn't win anything from their suit, but again, that was an injustice. That would be like if we were in this room and a guard was murdered in us. And Mobley consists of different pods, and by pods I mean, say there were 5 or 6 prison pods where inmates were housed. It's completely separate, in separate buildings, but they were further protected because they were in the protective custody unit. And so clearly they wouldn't have had even wanted to participate or be involved in the unfortunate incident that occurred. But again, the guards, what we did is myself, we took a newspaper reporter, we took a reverend from here and a public official to go up to the prison, and we went around and we did talk with inmates, and we did try to make sure that the retaliation wasn't still taking place against all the inmates in that facility for that unfortunate murder that occurred. And to the best of my knowledge, the 1 or 2 inmates who were involved were prosecuted. But again, we had got information that this retaliation was going on, and so we were able to get involved and get it a halt, even though it resulted in a lawsuit against us, which again, fortunately, a law professor from the University of Missouri, she was able to get the suit dismissed.
In your time doing Zebra Sunrise and putting that show together, was there a time that you were approaching the program and the work that you thought, I don't know if we're going to be able to pull this off?
Sorry.
Was there a show or was there an event related to the show that you thought, this is a stretch, I don't know, it's going to require some serious luck and perseverance to pull it off?
No, I mean, we were surprised that Dr. Leroy Black did come on to our show for an interview, given most probably prison administrators viewed our program as an annoyance, except for probably those who were interested in rehabilitation as opposed to just punishment. So
that must have seemed like a major coup to get the director of the Department of Corrections for this great state of Missouri to end up on your radio show that's all about critiquing their system.
Well, back in that time, again, you had 2 governors that were for prison reform. You had Governor Teasdale, who had been a Democratic governor. He was for that. And Governor Bond, who was a moderate Republican, he was for that. And so he must have approved his director being able to come up and be interviewed on our show here live at KOPN. So that, to me, just was a big change for that the governor and the director didn't look at it as something risky to do.
So Zebra Sunrise wasn't about KOPN, it wasn't about James Robnett or any successive hosts, it was about these Missourians experiencing incarceration.
It was about trying to improve their conditions. I mean, as I said, Ron Parton was beaten unconscious by the warden then of the Missouri State Penitentiary. Prior to that, inmate activist in the Missouri prison named Leon Dent was found hung in his cell. And somehow they were able to cover that up. every inmate I spoke with about it said he was hung by guards. And of course, the institution was claiming otherwise. They would normally say a person committed suicide. I wasn't around when the incident happened, but everyone I've talked to said Leon was an activist in the prison, and this is what happened to him as a result of his activism. So we were trying. Today, when I go into an institution, you don't have that retaliation culture per se. I'm not saying we were the cause of it, but I think for what we fought for, and it was not just an effort in Missouri, people were doing this nationwide. I believe gradually prison systems did change to be, yes, part punishment for the offense inmates had committed, but offenders had committed, but two, to a degree, a rehabilitation culture did filter in. But then again, in 1992, when Clinton was being a moderate and Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took over Congress, they passed the Truth in Sentencing law, which is the law that led to the mass incarcerations that are going on today. When we worked in the prison system, the population was about 15,000 inmates. Today, well, at its peak, after the Truth in Sentencing version of that law got passed in Missouri, it got up to 32,000 inmates. So when you say mass incarceration, it doubled because people could not be considered for parole. The statutes took away the flexibility of the probation and parole boards to release a specific inmate based on their efforts to rehabilitate themselves in prison and come back out in society and be positive and productive in society. Then with those truth in sentencing laws, you had to serve 50% of your sentence, 85% before you could even be considered for parole. That doesn't mean you got paroled, it just means you finally could get a parole hearing. And an example of that here in Columbia, a former inmate just a couple of years ago, Demetrius Woods. He has a business right at Range Line and Business Loop 70. Under the old sentencing laws, he would have had to serve 85% of his sentence due to drug distribution was his. Well, when the Republicans decided to work with people who were trying to achieve reform, what they did it for fiscal reasons. Department of Corrections said if we don't change these laws, we're going to have to build 2 more new prisons. And so they said, okay, we'll help nonviolent offenders. So Demetrius Woods, when the legislature changed the laws for drug distribution, he sued for his release. And the district court in Missouri agreed and ordered his release because he had served 50% of his time, and I don't know what else he had shown that he should be released, but he was released and started his business. Well, the Department of Corrections, the state, appealed. And they said, no, he shouldn't have been released because that law didn't apply retroactively. It would only apply to future inmates. And so we, again, pulled together a coalition, and Democrats and Republicans and other people who were just concerned about it. and fought a successful. The governor actually allowed him, because we kept challenging it. He lost at the appeals court level because the attorney general went and the corrections wouldn't stop their fight. And so he appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court, and they said the legislature didn't mean the law to be retroactive, because it would have also benefited an additional 124 inmates who were similarly situated. So those battles still continue today, but and Demetrius, the governor, gave him clemency and allowed him to serve the remainder of his time from home until he can be released. But so the fight continues today, but these were things that all four of us were fighting on different issues back then.
You've touched on this in a couple of answers, but the show has been off the air for 30 years. I think it wrapped up in the early 90s.
Okay.
What do you think is the legacy of Zebra Sunrise?
Well, for instance, one of the other shows that began after I left Zebra Sunrise, a community activist, the late Waner Faye Elbert, she said, "Robnett, I want to start a show." And she named it Straight Talk, and it was about issues in the community. And so it allowed her, and for instance, one of the issues we fought on through her show was the Citizen Police Review Board. We had worked with a coalition again of organizations, and our current state representative, David Smith, was involved in that movement. But my point is, even Straight Talk allowed us to work on issues that we felt were important to people in the community. So, and I think again, Waner Faye was used to hearing our show, and it gave her the idea of starting Straight Talk, and KOPN allowed her to do that program successfully for years. And so I think the legacy shows that how the station is open to activists like her, like myself, Octavia. Well, Jim probably got Jim Ellinger, his activist, from his brother, who was an activist at Missouri U and then became an attorney, lived out in the Indian Hills, formed a association out there where they fought for affordable housing. But I'm saying to me, KOPN has that kind of effect of allowing activists on various community or social issues to speak out on those, regarding their activism on those issues, or even Mark Heim at the Peace Nook. Or we used to have, oh God, my memory chip is so bad today, but we used to have a grocery store right on Hitt Street. I can't remember if that was Locust or Chestnut, but it sold fresh foods and vegetables, and it was kind of your what would be a modern day Clover's, because it had health supplements as well as fresh foods, and so till it finally had to close. But again, people could come up here and talk about eating healthy and doing things to keep yourself healthy. So I don't say we were a legacy, but we're part of the legacy of KOPN and allowing progressive and humanistic ideas to be expressed in mid-Missouri.
There is not a show on the air right now about prison reform. Do you think there's a potential? these kind of issues to be talked about in a general interest show, or at least a segment on another show?
I think there's a possibility. I recently, again, a former inmate has moved to Columbia, and he's trying to revitalize the programs, community programs of another former inmate, Glenn Cobbins. And this former inmate is named Lonnie Lockhart Bay, but Glenn Cobbins used to have a program called Destiny of Hope, where he tried to work with people in the community, and especially formerly incarcerated people in the community. So they're trying to revitalize that. They've asked me would I serve on their board, and I've agreed to do so. But now that you bring this up, I'm gonna toss the idea out to Lonnie Lockhart Bay to see if that's something he would be interested in doing, because he's facing those issues now. Even myself, I just tried to help a cousin that was released from prison. It worked out in a way it didn't work out, but my point is those issues still are real today, and so there's the possibility. I'm not going to say it'll happen, but at our next board meeting, I will let them know if the station's interested in trying to reinstate a program similar to Zebra Sunrise. And that was the bad thing about Zebra Sunrise. I think the former program manager back then, Bill Waxett, wrote CETA grants to help those 3 inmates do the program, but then when the money ran out, of course, all of them had to seek real jobs out. Well, this is a real job too, but they had to seek other jobs for them to keep their bills paid in the community, to feed themselves and their families. So I don't know if that's, I know my work was volunteer with that program, but even myself, after I finished school, my life changed, and so I could no longer do the show. One, I had to stop doing the show to be able to focus on school and finish school, but I periodically would come in. But 2, we did try to get other people to try to continue the show, but it just, those people were doing it on a volunteer basis, even some of the former inmates. But again, they had to focus on their day-to-day life needs and get jobs that paid money to meet their daily needs and responsibilities.
And obviously this is about KOPN's history. As you're talking about this, and we're talking about how the show really was just a megaphone for your and other people's activism, well, why couldn't that be the case in 2022 with Lonnie Lockhart Bay and other activists who are working on different issues and aren't necessarily radio producers, but we can fix that. We can work around that if there's people who are working on stuff and issues that need to be heard and voices that need to be shared, and it's as simple as just making some connections. We've got a programming committee that exists just to get proposals for new shows.
Well, I know I used to come back sometime to talk on some of these issues, but I would come when Tim Hudspeth was doing Straight Talk, because as you stated, Zebra Sunrise no longer existed, so we would bring up those issues on the Straight Talk program. But yeah, maybe we can find a way to get a similar program started again.
The show you're talking about, Zebra Sunrise and Straight Talk, and there was even a Native Heartbeat. There was a show that focused in that same era on Native American issues. These shows represent to me the activist lineage of KOPN. There's a strong, obviously, musical thread through KOPN and talk and entertainment shows, but that activist lineage, I feel like, is what makes us special, and it really highlights how we are a community-based nonprofit, that every other radio station is a corporate entity. Even some stations at the left end of the dial are pretty corporate, and KOPN remains. You brought some music. Did you have regular music that you featured on the
Yeah,
show?
when I would take breaks on the show, I would even play activist music. So one of my favorite activist musicians was Gil Scott-Heron, and we would play his various poetry pieces done to music, such as H2O Watergate Blues, which seems, even though that was about the Watergate era, that keeps coming back up in our history. The revolution would not be televised. And even when we had the divestment protests at the university where Nelson Mandela was incarcerated by the apartheid regime in Africa for his activism. And so I had stopped doing, whereas Zebra Sunrise was still trying to exist. This was another issue because even here, the university arrested protesters at the divestment protests at the university. And again, we fortunately were able to get an attorney to represent those individuals. I was there the day the people got arrested as an observer with attorney Dan Viets. But Gary Oxenhandler, I did do legal research that we had a First Amendment right. I believe it was a case out of Utah that was a case that decided we had the right, but Gary Oxenhandler ordered the case and argued the case, and everyone got released. And so I would play Gil Scott-Heron's Johannesburg song on the air to talk of, or Stevie Wonder's song about Dr. Martin Luther King. And that was another point I'll make about KOPN. They were always at the City of Columbia's Dr. Martin Luther King celebration. On his birthday that evening, we would have an award ceremony at a church, a remembrance and award ceremony. And KOPN always broadcast that evening ceremony. And so, again, that was greatly appreciated.
Well, we've been talking about KOPN and Zebra Sunrise and these formerly incarcerated people who were part of the show. In terms of you, James Robnett Jr., what skills did you get from this experience that have helped you beyond? I mean, I'm kind of thinking, when I see James Robnett, it's like you're a fully formed person. I can't imagine ever being a kid, James Robnett, because I've only known you as this, like, articulate attorney who, works on a state level and is dealing with poverty and prison issues. But thinking back 40 plus years when you were, and we were all much younger people, is there something you got from your time here that has helped you going forward?
I just feel that it's important to have a radio station like KOPN to inform the public about these issues. And so because as you stated, I'd never be able to go on other radio stations and play Gil Scott-Heron. I've only heard it played on one other station in mid-Missouri, and it was a university station, not at this school, but not at MU. But I think because of the activism, you're not going to get advertisers per se. We do have businesses, I'm sure, that contribute and help pay for support shows here at KOPN, but most radio stations are on for business purposes. And so they're going to greatly limit what's said as not to hurt their profits. And so that's what I've learned, the importance of having a community-based radio station in a community is very important to get critical issues out to the public that may not get out by trying to access the regular media, the paid media.
If this applies, what's your favorite event that the station hosted?
Well, for me, it would be the Martin Luther King program, the city's annual Martin Luther King program. I think that more than anything attests to what most activists are about, trying to make. He was a person who was trying to make society better for everyone. And I think that's what KOPN stands for as well. And so it was great to again have the station there broadcasting that service and that program, that award ceremony, to let people know there are those issues still remain to be worked on, trying to improve the plight of humankind.
Well said. Hopefully KOPN continues to play that role. Tell me about a famous person that you met through KOPN.
Again, it would be Gil Scott-Heron. I mean, Jesse Jackson came here, but I didn't get to meet him. I saw him get out to go into his car to go into Second Baptist Church, and coincidentally, he had worked for a group called the Rainbow Coalition back then. But when he got out of his car, a rainbow actually was in the air at the church. But Gil Scott-Heron came here to perform at the Blue Note one year. And again, people at KOPN let me know, and I was able to personally meet him. I can't remember. I know he was here first, and then I actually really got to meet him over at the Blue Note, because they probably interviewed him here prior to going, so I didn't get to talk to him in the building, but with the entourage from the station that took him over to the Blue Note, I was able to, they contacted me and I was able to. He's the most important person I feel I met that I knew and met directly through KOPN.
You kind of touched on this already when you talked about the prison director coming on the show, and I don't want to ask the question and answer it, but tell me about an on-air moment that you will always remember, or that stands out significantly for you.
Gosh.
Or maybe a variant on that question that I kind of wanted to ask is, tell me about an incarcerated person whose life was impacted by Zebra Sunrise.
Well, I think Ron Parton's life. Unfortunately, Ron passed away from a vehicle accident after he got released. But
so maybe let's rewind. Introduce us to Ron Parton, please.
Ron Parton had gone into prison. He was convicted of an offense here in this area. And we got word that inmate, I don't know, again, was up at Mobley, and I don't know if this was related to the incident where the guard was murdered. It may have been a different prison riot at Mobley. But the Department of Corrections brought 2 busloads of inmates down to the main penitentiary and kept them on the bus. They were all handcuffed, feet and arms. And what we were told is the warden came out, the warden of the Missouri State Penitentiary, Donald Wyrick at the time, came out and went through the bus with a leather blackjack. I guess it had a weight inside of it. It was thin. going down the aisles of the bus just smacking people. And that he then pulled Ron Parton off one of the buses. And in between the bus, where both inmates could see from the buses, beat him unconscious. And the message to the inmates, which he vocalized, was, you don't come down here and bring that stuff down here that you did up in Moberly. And I suspect whatever the incident was, these were the inmates who were rounded up as participants, and that's why I think this was a separate incident and not tied to the one where the guard was murdered on, I think, a July 4th weekend. And so we somehow got word about the incident, and we began to look into it, but there were others as well. And the fact that I used to visit him in the prison. And one day when I went to the prison, someone in the prison stabbed a guy standing next to Ron Parton. And the inference we drew was that it was meant for Ron, but maybe they didn't know that inmate didn't know which one was Ron, and maybe stabbed the wrong person. So we were able to get Ron removed from the Missouri State Penitentiary and put in the Cole County Jail for his safety. And he would tell me, James, every time an inmate has a hearing at the courthouse, some of them bring a message from the warden saying he's willing to make a deal. And we said, no, because this violence has got to stop. And what we were told, the warden had a group of guards that the inmates called the Goon Squad that would carry out retaliatory actions against inmates. And so, a matter of fact, another time I went in there, I just coincidentally went to see an inmate named McKinley Robinson. He had been beaten, and I could see all the bruises, etc., on him. And again, we were able to ask for an investigation into his beating, get him protected. One of the guards decided to let the investigators know what really happened. And it started out as an incident between McKinley Robinson and one of the guards on the prison grounds, and escalated into a fight. And then McKinley was taken to an area, I guess, in the prison where then he was physically assaulted. And so we were able, I think we were able to have an impact on cutting down, maybe not eliminating these beatings, but in McKinley Robinson, we were able to stop further harassment for him. And Ron Parton, he was able to finally get attorneys, as I stated earlier, and you can Google it. Ron Parton versus Wyrick, I'm almost positive that's the name of the case, Donald Wyrick, where he won a civil case, a $96,000 jury verdict for the warden violating his constitutional rights of beating him without due process of law. So another inmate, Larry Thomas, he's alive, he lives in the area. He's the one that sued the department, Lewis Mack. I don't know if there were other plaintiffs, to get the old penitentiary declared unconstitutionally overcrowded, and tried to improve the medical conditions, treat services, but they lost on that issue. But again, our actions were efforts to try to improve or change the circumstances that they were under. So with Ron Parton, he won his case. With McKinley Robinson, I'm still trying to track him down. He's in St. Louis somewhere. He used to work at the restaurant that was on Oprah's show, Sweetie Pies. But when I went to meet, he had stopped working there and I missed him. But I think we helped a number of inmates through serious, well, in Larry's case, we got him put into the educational release program because the warden Wyrick had been fighting that. And Larry went to Lincoln, got his bachelor's, then stayed in Jeff City, got his master's degree. And he, when I went to tell him that our efforts, not just KOPN, but legislators we had worked with too, they had got the department to agree to let him be in that program. That led to him getting his bachelor's degree at Lincoln and then automatically being eligible for parole, where then he could go there and get a master's degree. He later got married, has four kids, and he, when I went to see him to tell him, man, we were able to get you into that program, he says, yeah, the warden was just in here to tell me, and the week before he had threatened my life. So I think we did make a difference in trying to get the Department of Corrections to move toward a rehabilitation culture and out of that old style. If you look at the movie Brubaker, that's an example of what I'm talking about, getting the old style prison cultures nationally to move to more rehabilitation style as opposed to the strictly punishment style.
You, James Robnett, have been involved in prison reform for 40 plus years. You did this radio show for a chunk of time in the middle of it that has, as we've heard today, changed people's lives. That's got to feel satisfying.
Well, I think it also changed the lives of the 3 inmates who were part of the show. Jim Ellinger, as Christine Gardner told me, is still doing radio down in Austin, Texas. Unfortunately, Bush Grace has passed for health reasons, but Octavia Hayes, I mean, this gave all 3 of them jobs and led them to leading productive lives out in our community. And Octavia is still alive, and I've got to track her down, but I'm sure working and taking care of her responsibilities today. And this station gave them that opportunity.
How has this station changed from the time you first walked in here until today, whether physical or cultural or just the way you hear it over the air?
I mean, it still serves the community. I mean, other than having an updated equipment in the broadcast room, I think it serves the community. Of course, it relies on support from the community. And so I think it's still meeting the mission of the community radio station, trying to help and benefit the community that it is. I mean, when I came even in 1976, I not only discussed Democrat and Republican candidates, at that time, Angela Davis was running as the vice presidential candidate with Gus Hall on the Communist Party ticket. And there were other parties other than the 2-party system, and I brought up those candidates. But my point is, I don't think I would have, and my vision then was I would see in other countries that they, whether Italy, France, and in other countries, more than just a 2-party system. And so I kept wondering, why don't we have more than a 2-party system here? But we're able to discuss that here at KOPN. I'm not sure if we, and I'm a member of the Democratic Party. I participate that way, but my point is that all radio stations, I think, would entertain Democrat and Republican politics. I'm not sure if they would be willing to entertain candidates from other political parties or persuasions. I'm not sure how open they would be to that, or if they would think that would affect their bottom line.
I don't know when the last time I heard a Communist Party candidate on KBXR. We've talked about a lot we've been at about an hour and a half. Do you have what do you want to cover? What do you want to talk about that we haven't talked about? What questions do you want to answer that we haven't talked about? I asked about the T-shirt. Did you have a favorite KOPN T-shirt?
Actually, I wasn't into the T-shirts. I was more into our coffee mugs.
Let's ask that question. What was your favorite KOPN coffee mug?
Gosh, I think I still have it at home. It was just I'd have to bring it to describe it, but it was, it was just a simple coffee mug and about KOPN's mission of being a community radio station. So.
My favorite coffee mug, that we have a glass case out here that has kind of some ephemera, some historical ephemera.
Wow.
And there's a copy of this mug in there, and it's a person's face, and the handle is an ear. And it says, "You should ear KOPN. You should ear what you've been
wow.
missing."
Okay. That's pretty good.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I was more into the coffee mugs, I think, because when I was coming on air, I had been in law school, but after that I did a master's degree in public administration at MU, and that's when we had the divestment protests. And so I don't do it now as much, but then I was always having to live on caffeine because of my academic work as well as community work. So.
Well, we got a semi-fresh pot of folders out here if you want some.
Well, the water is great.
Good, good.
But yeah, all I can say is the importance of KOPN's existence is what I learned first and foremost, to be able to get ideas to the public that might be limited, curtailed, and not even allowed at other radio stations. So we could come here and talk about the divestment protests and movement. And that, well, the reason I bring that up is because the people who initially started the movement at MU were younger than me, and they just believed in direct action, just going into the board of directors meetings, at the curators meetings at university to disrupt those meetings and call for divestment. And so me and another guy, golly, I'm drawing a blank on his name, Adai, he's a Muslim, but from America, but we talked to them and just said, look, people get tired of your disruptive activities. We're not saying don't do that, but you've got to build public support for your movement among the students, the professors, and the community at large. And so we started working with them to do that, and we actually got a legislator, Bill Clay Jr. He was in the Missouri, either House or Senate at the time, but he got the legislature to pass a divestment statute, at which then Mizzou was forced to say, uh-oh, we've got to change, or we will have to divest. But we brought him to campus to speak. We started doing rallies. We even tried to bring a guy in, Randall Robinson, I believe Randall was out of New York, not D.C., and I can't remember the name of his movement, but he was active in promoting liberation, support for liberation movements in Africa back then, not just South Africa, but the remaining colonies that existed back then. But the university canceled his speech, and the student association was bringing it, and that was part of that divest. Now later they brought, I shouldn't be forgetting his name at all, the actress Ruby Dee, who was her husband, Ossie Davison, to speak, and so I was able to meet him. I don't know if he got to speak here, but I was able to shake his hand and say thank you for always doing the right thing, because you know he was in that movie that Spike Lee did called Do the Right Thing. So it's, again, to me, that's the importance of KOPN, that people like him and people like all of us who were fighting on those issues had a place where we could come and get our voice out to the public about these issues, and not, even if we spoke to another radio station, they were going to limit or do an interview and cut and edit it so it limited what our message was. And so here we could fully discuss the issues we were working on, fighting on. And so I'm planning to be a supporter of KOPN for years to come.
Very good. Thank you. Do you feel like we've said it all?
I think we have. I just wish, I'm hoping Christine is able to get a hold of Jim Ellinger, and I'll try to track down Octavia Hayes, and maybe you all can get a statement from him, and maybe one from Octavia.
That's great. This is James Robnett. My name is Trevor Harris. This has been one interview that is part of the KOPN Oral History Project. James was the host for several years of Zebra Sunrise, a prison issues and prison reform program. Thank you very much for making the time today.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you.